Welcome to Talking Point from the Church's Fellowship for Psychical and Spiritual Studies.
Dealing with a Poltergeist. Max Magee. A paper delivered on the 9th of September 1990 at the Third Ecumenical Conference on Christian Parapsychology. This article may reflect the language and attitudes of the time in which it was written. Responsibility for opinions expressed herein rests solely with the author, and such opinions must not be taken to represent those of the CFPSS. We offer it here as a talking point to spark your own thoughts and discussions. A talk has to have a title, and this one, Dealing with a Poltergeist, does indicate the general subject, but it is misleading in two ways. First, it suggests that somehow we were in control of the situation. As the story unfolds, you may well decide that this is far from the truth. In the second place, the title might seem to be claiming that answers are going to be suggested. To avoid disappointment on this score, expect questions instead. In telling this personal poltergeist story in very brief outline, the intention is to share some facts with you, and to put forward some thoughts about how, and why, these disruptive and frightening things happen. My bias towards a particular explanation and method of treatment will be only too obvious. And, of course, I would welcome discussion and disagreement, for I am as far from an understanding of this strange area as ever I have been. The action took place in a corporation housing scheme where each building consists of 4 units, 2 up and 2 down. The family who became the target of persecution occupied the upper left-hand unit. The parents, I shall call them Mr. and Mrs. Grant, were a young, intelligent couple in their 40s. There were 2 sons, one 14 years of age and the other 11. Their grandmother completed the household. In the flat directly below them lived an elderly couple with their grown-up son. I shall call them Mr. and Mrs. King. When the upstairs family first moved in, about 14 years previous to this date, it seemed that they all got on rather well together. However, the situation deteriorated. As the brothers became older, the downstairs neighbors accused them of being noisy, and the boys, in turn, felt restricted and frustrated. When our story begins, Mr. King downstairs has become very ill, possibly terminally ill. On Sunday, the 3rd of November 1974, just before Guy Fawkes Night, the neighborhood youngsters had been marking the event with fireworks and a bonfire, complete with a guy. As the 2 Grant brothers passed the bonfire on their way home, the older boy said jokingly, "I wish that was Mr. King there instead of the guy, then our troubles would be over." There is no doubt that the boy was joking, but as he told me about the incident. Much later it was clear that he connected the beginning of the trouble with that remark. When the boys went to bed that night, they were frightened by strange tapping sounds and scratchings from the headboards of their beds, and, even more, by loud shuddering hangings from within one of the walls of the bedroom. Soon the whole family was thrown into a state of agitated alarm. The police were called. They thought the noises might be coming from downstairs. But downstairs, Mr. and Mrs. King and his family could hear the noise, and they accused the upstairs family of somehow manufacturing the banging just to build up a case for getting themselves rehoused in better conditions elsewhere. The disturbance continued night after night, and often during the day as well. The activity spread to the nearby home of Mrs. Grant's sister. The police became involved on a regular basis. They were able to testify to the reality of the noises, but they times could not trace the source. They took the matter seriously, however, and assigned one of their officers, an inspector, to take special care of things. Within a week or so, many people had been brought in by the family to investigate and advise. Among them were the family doctor, the local Roman Catholic priest, the Church of Scotland parish minister, various mediums, Mr. Grant's employer, and others. The police inspector invited the professor of practical theology at Glasgow University to help, because he had already been involved in poltergeist cases. The Rev. Murdo Ewan MacDonald responded readily and was to play an important part throughout. The local authority sent workmen on a number of occasions to examine, repair, and renew electric wiring and plumbing, and to make sure that nothing in the loft or anywhere else in or around the building was causing the noise. The mediums had become involved, because at an early stage random tappings had formed themselves into a pattern. A code had been devised by the family, and soon a story was received about a mine disaster in the area in 1929 in which a number of miners had been killed. It was claimed that the spirits of the dead miners could not find rest and peace and needed help. However, in spite of the efforts of mediums and family, things got worse instead of better. It was right at the end of this first 4-week outbreak that I became involved. Late in the evening of Wednesday, the 4th of December, I received a telephone call from a medium friend of mine, Mr. Albert Best. He sounded very perturbed and asked me as a matter of urgency to come to the Spiritualist Center to meet a family in great trouble. I gathered that it had something to do with poltergeist activity. He said that Professor MacDonald was already there. When I arrived, I discovered a very distressed family. They had been driven out of their home that night by a crescendo of paranormal activity just when they were preparing to leave home for a séance at the Spiritualist Center. Windows had been broken by objects apparently thrown by some invisible force, and the noise had been frightening. They were unnerved and fled, first to their relatives who lived nearby, and then to the Spiritualist Center. So what was to be done? Séances had already been held on a number of occasions during the previous 4 weeks. There had been Christian services of cleansing and blessing. There had been a number of pastoral visits by different clergy. All this, and still there were explosions of violence. So it was decided that this time there should be a Christian service of exorcism and that Professor MacDonald should lead it. When we arrived at the house, everything had become quiet, though windows were broken and many articles lay around. Professor MacDonald gathered everyone in prayer. The atmosphere was strange and tense, but there were no unusual noises or movements. During the service he commanded the spirit, the poltergeist, the disturbing agent, whatever it was, to depart hence and leave the family in peace. While this was going on, I laid hands on each family member and silently asked for a blessing. The atmosphere was now peaceful, and the family were no longer in distress. We left and they were able to get some sleep. During the following 4 weeks relative quietness prevailed, punctuated from time to time by subdued noises and a few happenings. But then on the 6th of January 1975, trouble started again. The family had watched 2 television programs, one a horror film about the supernatural, and the other about a family in Newcastle who were being disturbed by a poltergeist. Our family felt that they also had something to contribute, so Mr. Grant started to make a tape recording of their experience as a poltergeist family. He had only been doing this for about 15 minutes when the fearsome noises and movements started up again and the sledgehammer noisy vibration began to shake the walls of the house. They had a very bad night. The next day, Mr. Grant telephoned Professor MacDonald and myself. We visited the family on the evening of the 8th of January and spent a considerable time discussing what had happened. The family were still favoring the mine disaster theory. We agreed that there might indeed be unquiet souls who were needing help, but we emphasized our belief that there had to be something else at work. We pointed out that this fresh outbreak had followed the family's renewed interest in the supernatural. We suggested that somehow the members of the family were themselves involved in the production of whatever energy was causing all the trouble. We pointed to the close emotional relationship between mother and sons, the mother's great interest in spiritualism, and the interest of her sister and her family in the same subject. We drew attention to the adolescent frustration of the 2 boys, to the father's passionate interest in what was going on, and to the family's general unhappiness about where they were living. We suggested that all this could add up to a very intense and powerful complex of emotions. We emphasized the part that fear played in this situation. We pointed out that when fear increased, the levels of noise and movement seemed to increase also, and that when we all made the effort to remain calm, there was relative peace. We could not say how this energy of the emotions was translated into the kind of destructive action we were experiencing, but even that might be mainly the responsibility of the family. It was possible, we said, that at some unconscious level, everything was being directed by one or more members of the family. We emphasized the point that this was not a matter of anyone being blessed, but rather a matter of trying to understand the mechanism of the thing. We had been over this ground before, but never so thoroughly. The family agreed to go ahead on the basis that this could be the true explanation of what was happening. I know that they remained a bit skeptical, but they promised that they would do all they could to maintain a calm atmosphere. We held a service of blessing, then left, feeling that, probably, the situation was once more under control. The disturbances continued on a subdued and intermittent level throughout January, and my impression was that the family was still exploring other ways of coping with the situation, which of course they were perfectly entitled to do. Whatever was going on during this period, alarming activity erupted again at the beginning of February. Once more the family sent out an urgent call for help, saying that they had decided that our explanation was the only one that they could trust. The family were not in great distress, but because of nighttime noises, shaking of beds and involuntary bodily movements of their sons, they were unable to get much sleep. They looked exhausted. I wanted to help but found the prospect daunting. So I asked permission of the family to bring in a colleague, Professor Archie Roy of the Department of Astronomy at Glasgow. They readily consented to this. We soon found that our presence often had a dampening and controlling effect on the paranormal activity, and therefore offered to take it in turns, when needed, to be with the family each night around bedtime and to stay with them until all was peaceful. Often this meant staying until 5 or 6 o'clock next morning. But tiring though this was for us, it was satisfying to see the family becoming stronger. It was however a constant and arduous struggle during these months, from February to May 1975. Clearly some kind of campaign of persecution was being waged. As the weeks passed there were the now familiar activities of sledgehammer noises, objects being thrown or levitating or shaking, moved by some unseen energy, and outbreaks of flooding from broken pipes and fire from the fusing of electric wiring. But to all this there was added an intensification of what seemed to be physical persecution of the two brothers. This usually happened when they were trying to go to sleep. To give you an idea of the kind of thing that would happen, here is an excerpt from Dr. Roy's notes. He writes, "There was a phase when the boys seemed to be tormented physically by the entity. They would be lying in their beds and I would be in the room. Suddenly one of the boys would begin to be twisted into all kinds of positions, which would be very difficult, I would have thought, for a human being to have got into. And sometimes he would be bounced. The younger one would be bounced in bed, while lying flat, as if he was on a trampoline, and he would rise to about 2 feet from the surface of the bed. I could not see how this could be done naturally by muscular control. In addition, he would then be hurled out of bed, and would have to pick himself up, or his arms would hit the wall or the headboard, so that he was hurt. Then the action would cease for a time, almost as if whatever was causing it did not like the pain." Now, here is an interesting point. Neither Dr. Roy nor myself witnessed any movement of objects, whether being thrown or levitating. However, we were convinced that such movements did take place. All such movements caused great alarm and seemed to be intended to do so. But there was one exception. It was more of an entertainment. About the beginning of May, the family were amusing themselves playing a card game. Suddenly the younger boy began to throw his cards wildly into the air as though compelled to do so. The older boy, on the other hand, began to produce a very polished sleight of hand routine, skillfully and with incredible speed. The family were amazed and felt that he was possessed. I have since been reminded of this incident when reading Carl Jung's words on what he calls the archetypal trickster figure, where he says, "Here the trickster is represented by counter-tendencies in the unconscious, and in certain cases, by a sort of second personality, of a puerile and inferior character, not unlike the personalities who announce themselves at spiritualist séances and cause all those ineffably childish phenomena so typical of poltergeists." Now, I have to admit that I don't know what view to favor in cases of apparent possession, but my sensations when dealing with the awful sledgehammer noises would support the idea of a something, which was very primitive, almost animal, being the instigator and director, though whether from the unconscious or wherever, I wouldn't know. On one occasion, for instance, I was summoned by the family at around 10:30 p.m. I entered the house unobserved and stood outside the room where they were. I could hear voices raised in excitement and there were sounds of agitated movement. When I opened the door, I saw the slightly built younger boy, lying on the floor throwing himself around, or so it seemed, while his very heavily built uncle was sitting astride him, trying to keep him still, but quite unable to do so. I felt angry, as though I was being personally challenged. I cannot explain why that was so. Anyway, acting without thinking, I spoke in a loud commanding voice which surprised everybody including myself, saying something like, "That's enough of this nonsense. Stop this at once." Everyone looked around, and the boy quietened down immediately. We all began to talk in normal conversational tones, and the uncle and the boy got up from the floor. In speaking like this, I was aware that I was not simply addressing those in the room but seemed, even more, to be giving orders to whatever it was that was causing the disturbance. After this, there were a few more noises, but not much, and soon the boys were in bed and asleep. So what were we dealing with here? A mischievous spirit of some kind? An impersonal bundle of psychic energy? Some kind of primitive entity from another world? Some force from the depths of the collective or personal unconscious? Whatever it was, we knew that we must not show fear, and that commands had to be issued firmly, whether aloud or mentally. And they usually worked very impressively. Were we then playing prospero to some entity's Caliban? It certainly often felt like that, and it would be very flattering to think of this as the truth. However, there was much more to it than that, as another incident indicated. This concerned the sledgehammer blows. These usually erupted from somewhere inside one particular wall in the boys' bedroom. They were deep booming sounds, and their force sent vibrations through the fabric of the entire house. Glass in the windows and doors would vibrate. Ornaments and pictures on the walls would shake. The shuddering could be felt through the floors. It always started the hairs on the back of my neck bristling until I was able to establish command of myself and the situation. Now, I wanted to get these noises recorded on tape. So, one night when the blows started, I asked permission of the family to allow the noise to continue unchecked, while I recorded it. This I did, outside the house first of all. Then, coming inside, where there was complete darkness, I carried out an experiment I had not told the family about. Normally, when I wanted to stop the noises from the bedroom wall, all I had to do was step into the room. They would then cease immediately, or soon after. So, for this experiment, standing outside the open bedroom door in complete darkness, I silently advanced my foot about 1 inch over the threshold. The noise stopped immediately. On withdrawing my foot, it started again, immediately. I repeated this a number of times, with the same result, and I had the strange, eerie feeling that I had been drawn into a game with whatever it was, and that I was being played with. So this wasn't just a primitive animal energy. There was, I felt, a much more formidable force here. This was not just a brutish Caliban, and I was certainly no prospero. There was another similar occasion. I was in the sitting room with the parents. The boys had gone to bed, and were well out of earshot. I whispered to Mr. Grant in an attempt to encourage him, "We'll beat this thing yet." There was then the most startling and frightening succession of sledgehammer blows, 7 of them, emanating as usual from the boys' bedroom, resounding and vibrating through the entire house, in a way that seemed to express extreme anger, even fury, at what I had said. I was very shaken. By the middle of May, 1975, Dr. Roy and myself became convinced that we had played this exhausting pastoral role for long enough. We insisted that the older boy should go away from home for a few weeks, because he seemed to be the central character in what was going on. The family at first resisted the suggestion and then agreed. It was arranged that he should go to stay with relatives at the end of the week. On Friday of that week, Mr. Grant told me that the boys had reported me as saying that everything would be finished by midnight. I didn't remember being so precise, but I wasn't going to argue. A series of knocks and bangs came seconds before midnight, and thereafter there was silence. I stayed until the early hours of the morning and then went home. For the remainder of the weekend there was peace. On Sunday the older boy left for his short exile. On that day also, or the day after, the downstairs neighbor, Mr. King, died. So, somehow, what began with him, ended with him, and in so doing, posed the biggest question of all. Or was this just a coincidence? For the remainder of the summer there were a number of aftershocks, but very subdued and infrequent, until finally they ceased altogether. And that is the end of the story.
You have been listening to Talking Point from the Church's Fellowship for Psychical and Spiritual Studies. To find out more, please visit www.churchesfellowship.co.uk.